You're very welcome to this Artist Talk event hosted by the GSA Christian Union. So Catriona MacKenzie is a visual artist who lives and works in the Cairngorms, and I've just realized I've never had to say that place before, so I don't think I said it right. In 2019, she completed her postgraduate studies at the Royal Drawing School, having previously studied MA Fine Arts Painting at Edinburgh College of Art at the University of Edinburgh. Drawing from observation, memory, and imagination, her work explores the interplay between word and image, seen and unseen realities, the epic and the everyday, the sublime and the personal, and lamentation and praise. We at the Christian Union exist to facilitate engagement with the claims and teachings of Jesus Christ, and we host weekly discussions towards that end. If anything is mentioned this evening, that's something you'd like to discuss further, we'd welcome you to join us and bring your thoughts, comments, questions, and/or objections. So do please feel free to join us. You can follow us on our social media with the GSA Christian Union on Instagram. There will be a time for a discussion / Q&A after Catriona's talk. So you're welcome to post your questions into the Zoom chat box now or after the event. At the end of the talk, a member of the CU will host our Q&A and put these questions to Catriona. And of course, there will be opportunity for you to ask your questions to Catriona directly. So we invite you to do that if you would prefer. For now, let's warmly welcome Catriona MacKenzie.
Thank you very much, Missy, and thank you to the Glasgow School of Art Christian Union for inviting me, and thank you everyone for showing up. It's really wonderful to be here, even virtually. And as Missy said, I'll just try and change slide. There we go. My work explores the image, the relationship between word and image, seen and unseen realities, the epic and the everyday, the sublime and the personal, and lamentation and praise. And I suppose that all these different themes are really important to the Book of Job. And the Book of Job is a really fascinating ancient book which has had quite a formative role in my life. I first started reading it as a 14-year-old when I was going through my own sort of turbulent time, an onslaught of very much first world problems. But I found it really resonated with me, and I think it shaped the way I view reality to a really large extent. And it shaped the choices I made later when I went to study art and art history at Edinburgh College of Art and Edinburgh Uni. I wrote my dissertation on William Blake's engravings for the Book of Job, and it later was a subject that I returned to when I did my postgraduate studies in London at the Royal Drawing School. And so the structure of this talk will be split between, I'll be introducing the Book of Job itself, and then we'll have a look at William Blake's responses to the Book of Job. And then we'll move on to my own work, my own visual art responses to it. But I thought I would share this image. I don't know if any of you were living in Glasgow. Probably a lot of you were. Back in 2018, I was living there. And at the Glasgow International Festival, Mark Leckie, the Turner Prize winner, showed this figure. It was at Tramway. And I'm just going to read. I went and saw this exhibition with a friend, but I thought I would read a passage by Laura Cummings, her review in The Guardian, because I feel she sums up what this piece of work is about really, really well. The huge figure looms in the darkness of the cavernous tramway. Job, covered in open wounds and boils. Based on a German carving, Mark Lecky's statue is larger than life and fully as profound, with its sorrowful face and putrefying sores. A poor soul lost in suffering, almost. He sits alone in melancholy contemplation, head in hand like Rodin's thinker. But what he's thinking is voiced in the air. The statue speaks, words emitting from his wounds and also from a screen in which the motionless Job is given some kind of life through a flux of shifting light and scenario. Time passes, place changes, the days speed and slow, still the prophet endures. He talks of his plagues, ancient and modern, bewildered by their harshness. And yet, there is still hope. He dreams of swimming and even flying. The lament is powerfully moving, not least because the Turner Prize-winning artist sets up a tension between the virtual and the real. The screen, with all its brilliant CGI effects, is restlessly compelling, and yet one is drawn loyally back to the poor statue. It is a gripping standoff between old and new technologies in which the biblical agonies of Job are made devastatingly present and timeless. And so the figure of Job has a place in contemporary thinking, contemporary art, also in literature. I finished reading Muriel Sparks' novel, The Only Problem, recently. And that is about the Book of Job and about a man, his kind of obsession with the Book of Job. The main character, Harley Gotham, is writing a treatise of it, and all the absurdities that happen in his life he reads through the lens of this ancient Old Testament narrative. It's interesting, this figure here, Nobodaddy, Mark Lecky's sculpture, it's also linked to the rest of this talk in a different way, in that the title Nobodaddy is it's taken from a poem by William Blake. Nobodaddy is his way of referring to God having no body. But I'll just explain a bit more about the story now. So it's a really ancient narrative from the Old Testament. It's really raising a question about suffering and why God, if he is good and if he's sovereign, why he would allow suffering in the world. And why does he allow the righteous to suffer especially? And so I'll just pick out aspects of the prologue and also the epilogue of this book. They are prose, so basically bookending the central, almost 30-something chapters of poetry and lament. There are two narrative sections of prose. And so you have the prologue here. I'll just read some of it now. Job chapter 1. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 5 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man of all the people of the East. His sons used to hold feasts in their homes on their birthdays, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom. One day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth, going back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." So God has basically pointed out Job as being a righteous man, and he's obviously proud of him. And then you have Satan challenging God. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So we've just had this dialogue between God and the devil, in which the devil is saying that Job basically only loves God and fears him for what he gives him, because he's very blessed with a lovely family and lots of wealth. And God is saying, very well, you can take away all these gifts and see if he'll still remain faithful to me. So already you're seeing this kind of movement from the kind of natural realm, the seen realities of the world, to the unseen realm, the kind of supernatural, if you like, between God and the devil. And so now we have the consequences of that dialogue between God and Satan. One day, Job's sons and daughters were feasting in their elder brother's house, and a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were ploughing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servant to the sword, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, the fire of God fell from the heavens and burnt up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house when suddenly a mighty wind swept from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I am the only one to tell you. At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. So that was Job's first test. And basically here you have, in chapter 2, which is also part of the prologue, you have Job's next test. Again, Satan presents himself before God. God says, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil, and he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. And then Satan replies, skin for skin, a man will give all he has for his own life, but now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it. As he sat among the ashes, his wife said to him, are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. He replied, you are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. And then we're introduced to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, who are the 3 friends of Job who feature really heavily throughout the book, particularly the poetry section. And this is kind of their shining moment. This is their best moment. They heard about the troubles that had come upon their friend, set out from their homes, met together and agreed to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. And then verse 12 says, when they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. And with that, we now enter into the poetry section. And here we have an image, a watercolor by William Blake. It's from the Butts set, made for the patron Thomas Butts in 1805. And you can see this is the scene where Job is with his wife and his 3 friends, and they're all kind of lamenting for his troubles. And you can see, if you look at him closely, there are boils there on his skin. It kind of looks like foul bite. If anyone is a printmaker here, what happens with your plates when you don't treat them properly? But it's quite, it's quite a sort of sanitized version of what Job probably did look like, which probably would have been more like the figure that Mark Leckey made based on the wooden carving. So what really takes place during the poetry section is a lot of toing and froing between Job and his friends. The Book of Job, which dates from, people estimate between like the 7th and 2nd century before Christ, before Common Era, and it belongs to a category of literature in the Bible known as wisdom literature, alongside the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And it's kind of different from Proverbs in that Proverbs is very much about retribution, like if you do wrong, you will suffer. And Job is actually challenging that. It's saying, well, there's often no direct causal effect between individual wrongdoing and suffering, and we see that so much in the world, with often like the best people suffering the most. But a lot of Job's friends, they're kind of well versed in this like ancient Hebraic kind of wisdom, and Job has to kind of contend with them in the midst of all his grief, the loss of his children, I think, being the worst, and also in his, by far, but also like this really painful skin condition. He's having to sort of stand up for himself and say, actually, no, I haven't done anything specific to deserve this. I don't think this is punishment. It is from God, but he is in control of my suffering, but I'm not being punished for anything. And then towards the end, and we'll come in, we'll just look into this more as we look at Blake's work and my own work, God answers Job and reveals himself to him in a sort of quite curious way, and shows him his sublime glory. And he doesn't give Job all the reasons for his suffering, but he does show him himself, and that really, it humbles Job, and in a different way to how he's been humbled by his suffering. It's like a humbling, like being in awe of someone, and then we see him be restored to his like pre-suffering life, but kind of much better. So I'll just quickly read this epilogue. So this is from the very end of the Book of Job. After the Lord had said these things to Job, when he answered Job out of the storm, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am angry with you and your 2 friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. So take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. You have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. So Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite did what the Lord asked them, and God accepted Job's prayer. After this, Job prayed for his friends, and the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. All his brothers and everyone who had known him before came and ate with him in his house. They comforted him and consoled him over the trouble the Lord had brought him, and each one gave him a piece of silver and a gold ring. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. The first daughter was named Jemima, the second Keziah, and the third Karen Hapuch. Nowhere in all the land were found women as beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers. After this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation. And so Job died an old man and full of years. Right, so thanks for bearing with me as I read loads, both the prologue and the epilogue of Job. I made these I made some tables to kind of explain the structure of the book. I won't go through it too much, but it's sometimes easier to understand the structure with the diagram. And so if you see on the left, we have a column that says unseen realm and seen realm. And yeah, so you see how, like, I don't want to kind of say that there's this massive divide between the spiritual and material, but there are, according to the Book of Job, unseen realities, which have an effect on the seen realities that we experience. And I noticed when I was studying this, a kind of symmetry within the Book of Job. If you look at the yellow column, you see Job has his family and wealth, and then you have the theme of intercession, which is, I'll kind of come back to that when I'm looking at some of my own work. It's the idea of, in this case, of Job's interacting with God on behalf of other people. He's sort of pleading the cause of someone else. He's being a mediator. And so in the first instance, in the prologue of Job, we see him pleading for his children, that God will look favorably upon them. And then at the other end of the narrative, he's pleading on behalf of his friends. And you have, with the blue columns, worship, which is a really big theme. And you could argue that throughout the poetry section in the middle, there is lots of worship. It's lament and worship, and often those overlap. So if you're interested in thesis, antithesis, synthesis, dialectics, there we have it. Right, so now I move on to William Blake, and my main focus here is going to be on a set of 22 engravings that Blake made for his friend and patron, Thomas Linnell. He signed a contract to do this in 1823, and they were completed in 1826. And you can see the first plate and the last plate here. Blake obviously had quite an understanding of the structure of the Book of Job, and that you see these visual similarities between the first and last plate. And so he's recognizing that the beginning of Job is quite similar to the end. And you see Job with his family, his 3 daughters, 7 sons, all his wealth surrounding him in both of them. In the first one, you have Job with, there are instruments above him, but they're not being played. And I think to Blake, he understood this to mean that at the start of the narrative, Job was maybe worshipping God in this kind of like quite detached, legalistic way, not actually like fully engaging in worship. If you see in the altar on the first panel, it says, "The letter killeth and the spirit giveth life. It is spiritually discerned." And by the letter killeth, they mean the law killeth. So if you see in the background as well on the first image, it's you've got Mount Sinai and also a Gothic cathedral. And for Blake, Gothic architecture was like highly spiritual, whereas sort of neoclassical stuff symbolized deism, which was the religion of the Enlightenment as he saw it. This idea that there was a God who created the world, but then just sort of left us men to their own devices. And it's interesting as well, I hadn't noticed this before, but in the surrounding panels of these engravings, the borders rather, you've got an altarpiece there, and that's kind of, I guess, in reference to the fact that Job in the first instance has been praying for his family or making sacrifices for his family, and in the final plate he's been doing that for his friends. The central panels of Blake's 1823 engravings for the Book of Job were literally traced from a set of watercolors that he made in 1805 for his friend and patron Thomas Butts. And this is an example, and we saw some earlier of the Butts watercolor set. And the borders he added later as an afterthought, and they contain lots of scriptural references which highlight the fact that Blake really knew his Bible, like many people in his day. And he was born in 1757, I should add. Like many people in his day, he learned to read using the Bible. He came from a family of English dissenters, so they were Protestants, but they weren't into like the Church of England. He was born in Soho in London. His father was a hosiery. And Blake is a really interesting character. He's known as a visionary, and he claimed from an early age to have seen visions of angels. And when he was doing his apprenticeship as an engraver between the ages of 14 to 21, he spent a lot of time making engravings of the antiques, the different objects in Westminster Abbey, and he claimed to have seen a vision of Christ with the apostles and a procession of saints and monks, and actually heard them chanting. And so Blake's understanding of reality was really at odds with that of his Enlightenment peers. Many of us, like many people, will have seen images of like his sort of derogatory images of Isaac Newton. He really didn't like Newton, who sort of was involved in bringing about the scientific revolution. He mentions him in this quotation. And so if you notice, so I'll just read this top quotation here, which I think is quite an important entry point for understanding Blake's Job engravings. It was written in a letter to Thomas Butts, the patron of the watercolor set, at around the time that he was making these watercolors for Thomas Butts. So he says, "Now I a fourfold vision see, and a fourfold vision is given to me. 'Tis fourfold in my supreme delight, and threefold in soft Beulah's night, and twofold always may God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." And the quotation below, "I rest not from my great task, to open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of man inwards, into worlds of thought, into eternity, ever expanding in the bosom of God, the human imagination." And so I'll just share this image, because Blake believed that there was more to life, more to reality than meets the eye. And I think that's why he was maybe drawn to the Book of Job as a subject. And rather than like the way I would see it, that there are some things we just can't see, he actually had this very specific system of thought which he had constructed. And he actually saw reality as broken up into 4 distinct realms. And he took that from Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a really famous, massively influential Swedish mystic who I think he's not that famous. Like, I hadn't really heard of him, but he has influenced lots and lots of writers, even like C.S. Lewis and people. But Swedenborg believed that there were 3 distinct realms of existence, and Blake added another realm to it. And I think for Blake, this idea of there being 4 different levels of perception that you can have maybe corresponded with the idea that there were these 4 distinct realms of existence. And so this plate here, which comes from towards I guess the climax of Job, towards the end, you can see the celestial realm, which Blake called Eden, the spiritual realm, which he named Beulah, which is derived from Isaiah, and the natural realm, which is the one that we all occupy. And are used to is generation, and then outside existence, which is Allro. It's quite complex, but he basically believed that, I think the way he understood the Book of Job, or liked to interpret it, was that Job went through this journey of spiritual awakening. But for Blake, that was kind of imaginative spiritual awakening. His eyes were increasingly open to the reality of who God is. But for Blake, that was kind of God, Jesus were kind of conflated with the imagination. So he called Jesus a human imagination. And so, like, you can compare these two plates from Job's first image that we saw, Job with his family before any of the trauma happens, and then which could be seen as like a single vision of reality, as all in the generation plane, the natural realm, and then this dramatic image towards the climax when God is revealing himself and saying, who is it who made the world? Who is it who put Pallades in its place and contains the snow in the heavens and things like that? When we see the grandeur of God in this, Job is being given some increased perceptual access to other realms of reality as Blake saw it. I'm now going to just sort of work through at a slightly faster pace Blake's engravings. So this is plate 2. This is also from the prologue of Job, when the devil is presenting himself with the angels in front before God, and you can just see the way he presents the devil is really like he's making this massive balletic leap into the center of the panel. He's full of energy, very dynamic, and God is very stoic and still, and actually looks really similar to Job, which is quite interesting. And I found this quote, which Blake came up with. The Bible says that God formed nature perfect, but that man perverted the order of nature, since which time the elements are filled with the prince of evil, who has power of the air. And you can see the devil is occupying that space in the air here. And I also just thought that this particular quotation had quite a lot of pertinence for this day and age, where we have this airborne disease on the go. And I don't know, it just had more resonance to me than when I first read it a few years ago. And if you read that in the context of the Book of Job, you're thinking, well, God allows that, you know, so he's given the enemy a sort of some reign, but he's kept on a leash. And when I was on the drawing year, I was really blessed to have been able to do a residency in Italy, and my friends and I went to Siena, and I was really like fell in love with Duccio, and was particularly struck by these panels in which he depicts the devil as this really dark, shadowy figure, really like quite like it was. The top image, I think it must have been repaired. I couldn't find an image of it, but it was, yeah, I couldn't find an image of how I remember it, but I thought there's something so unattractive and unappealing about that, that devil that Duccio presents, which sort of fitted better with my understanding of the devil than Blake's devil, which is, he's sort of quite attractive almost, but Blake had quite an interesting relationship, like our understanding of who the devil is. He did say that Satan is in a state of error and beyond salvation. He was, however, attracted to his energy. And I think within this particular plate here, plate 2 of the Job engravings, the devil's kind of like a Dionysius figure, and God's more like Apollo. So it's like one is energy and dynamism and revelry and fun, and the other one is kind of law and order, which I think is quite interesting. Oops. This is a scene of the enemy, like that horrible, awful tragedy with all of Job's children being killed, which is the part of the narrative that like creates by far the most horror in me, and I think most people. And it's very, like, you could see it as quite a romantic image. If you think about Jericho's Raft with the Medusa, it's a similar sort of time. And then you have the messengers escaping to tell Job about these terrible things. You have the first messenger there, and in the background you see another one running. You can see the direction of Job's gaze is up towards this winged scepter, the devil figure. He's been given wings here, and he's standing on this round Newtonian earth. Again, we have an interaction between God and Satan. And the natural consequences of that interaction. So Job's second test being that he had awful boils on his body. He was physically in a lot of pain. That would have made him not only like in a deep state of agony, but also really repulsive to other people. And you can see in the borders, there are spiders and broken pottery and scenes of like winged creatures, like dangling spiders sort of mercilessly. At the Tate Britain, this wooden panel is on show in the Blake room. I spent a lot of time looking at it and drawing from it when I was doing my postgraduate studies. So it's made from around the same time as the engraving set. I should add that these engravings were some of the last things that Blake produced. So he died actually in 1820, is that correct? 1827, yes, a year after these plates were published. So it's kind of, yeah, like he's trained as an engraver, he's handled this subject before, but he's an experienced artist with quite developed worldviews, quite idiosyncratic worldviews. This is Blake's friends, Job's friends, coming, comforting him. Let the day perish wherein I was born. He doesn't want to be alive. He wish he hadn't been born. If you read the poetry section, it'll say things like, I wish I hadn't ever been born, and like food is tasteless to me. He can't eat and he also can't sleep. He's being tormented. So he's being attacked, like there's no respite from it. This plate really interests me because I think it shows a bit about Blake's understanding that he was quite influenced by like lots and lots of different types of thought. So I mentioned he was learned to read using the Bible, and he always like considered himself to be a Christian, and yet he really hated what he saw as like, and it's kind of constraints. Like he thought that we should be allowed to kind of do exactly what we wanted with our lives, and yeah. And he was influenced, amongst other things, by alchemical thought, which kind of like there's this, which like really prizes, amongst other things, the imagination. And he said, mental things are alone real. And I think what you see in this plate is it's basically, you can see the figure with the raised arm is one of Job's friends, and he's retelling a dream that he had of seeing God. So he's like, I have this knowledge of God and I can tell you authoritatively what your problem is and why you're suffering and that kind of thing. And I think it's interesting because the dream that occupies the top 2/3 of the central panel is drawn like with these like really straight scores with the burin. So it looks really robust basically and really alive, and what's below is just not nearly as tangible as that, the solidity of the dream. So he kind of believed that what is unseen is more real, has more substance than what we perceive with the five senses. So that goes very much against Enlightenment thought, which you have John Locke had written a really influential treatise in 1690, an essay concerning human understanding, in which he said all knowledge is reducible to sensory data. So anything that we can only know, and we should only meddle with that which we can see or feel or touch or smell or taste to be true, and that which we can prove to be real through scientific methods of investigation. And so Blake really like hated all that. And what you notice at the time is like in the visual arts, there's this rise in naturalism. People stop painting supernatural subjects. You have history paintings of religious themes, for example, the Nativity without angels, or Greek mythologies without the Minotaur. And also something that happened was a lot of artists stopped drawing from classical statuary. They started using live models. So Francisco Goya, Blake's contemporary in Spain, would be drawing from live models, and Blake was like, no. He continued to draw from classical statuary, believing that the essence of man can be seen in classical statuary. He was more interested in the essence than the particulars. And he said that, I'll quote him, "As to modern man without his clothes, he is like a corpse." And I actually think that would be quite inaccurate, like that would be quite fitting for the Book of Job. Job is known to have just survived by the skin of his teeth. Actually, that expression, surviving by the skin of your teeth, is from the Book of Job. Anyway, I'll move on to this next. This next scene, we see Job's friends accusing him, interrogating him, and Blake in the borders highlights the just upright man is laughed to scorn. And that for me, combined with the image, is very reminiscent of Christ at Gethsemane, and Christ when he's under, like in the lead up to his crucifixion generally, when he's being tormented and accused of wrongdoing, and actually you can't pin anything against him. And so Blake, to Blake, and I guess to many readers of Job, Job is like a kind of proto-Christ, or kind of, he points towards Christ, in that he's the righteous sufferer. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's there. And then this is the torment that he experiences. It's really awful, this hooved figure really pressing down on him. And yeah, that would also link to this idea of Job being kind of like a Christ figure. It's him in the depths of the earth, or him experiencing death and all its awfulness. This is a watercolor from the Butt set, which is kind of based on. This is one of my favorite images. It's when a young friend, Elihu, comes in, and he's a fourth friend, I guess, and he seems to sort of speak some sense. And that quotation that Blake used the King James version, of the Bible, which I guess would have been the most common one to use it in his day. And I am young and you are very old, wherefore I was afraid. Basically, Elihu is saying, I've held back. I haven't sort of pushed myself forward because I respect you for being, because I'm young and I want to honor age and wisdom. But now he sort of interjects and says, actually what you've been saying, Job's friends and Job hasn't been great. And he kind of prepares the way for God to reveal himself to Job. And yeah, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And as it says in the poster for this event, God really does that by asking Job loads of questions. He doesn't give Job answers for why he's suffering as such. And we as readers can see, oh, he's suffering because he's being tested in the spiritual realm. You know, God is concerned with being glorified, even in front of invisible realities, by Job's life, by Job's faithfulness, by him kind of clinging on to God and not speaking wrongly about him. But like bringing his lament, which can be an angry lament at God, and quite an ugly, messy lament, but God like is okay with that. God doesn't tell Job, oh, this is what I've been doing all along, this was my purpose, but he does answer him with his presence and with a really like profound encounter with his sublime glory and reminders that he was the one who made all of creation. And yeah, sort of asks him questions like, were you there when I created the sun and the star constellations and different things like that? It's really interesting poetry towards towards the end of the poetry section. And I found this quotation, if the doors of perception were cleansed, this is Blake speaking in 1790, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite. So this links to Blake's idea of there actually being like different unseen realms of reality which you can get perceptual access to by like your imagination opening up. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. And I think it relates quite well to this image. You have Job in this kind of cavern, this kind of cave. It's a bit like Plato's cave in the level of generation, Blake's generation. And then you have all these infinite, glorious, unseen realities being made visible to the viewer. That whole idea of that term, doors of perception, actually was picked up on by Aldous Huxley in his book, which was really popular in the 60s, and everyone was like taking drugs so that they can have doors of perception opened to them, they could see more of reality. So Blake was quite like a popular figure then, quite countercultural. One of the things God does when he answers Job is like showing him different creatures he's made, Leviathan and Behemoth. Behold now Behemoth, which I have made. Behemoth's meant to be a kind of hippopotamus figure, Leviathan, like perhaps some sort of sea creature. But it's to show the strength of God in comparison to Job. I mean, it's basically about his power and majesty, and showing like Job, like how small he is in relation to God, so that he can almost have an experience of coming out of himself. Like when you experience awe at some incredible sight like Grand Canyon, I imagine, you kind of realize how small you are, and you are, it's like really, actually, it's really good. I read an article about it in a magazine recently about how experiencing awe is actually really good for your mental health. And Job's suffering was on a physical and mental, like emotional, deep spiritual level. And I think seeing like just having your mind opened to like glorious reality, in this case of God, it kind of helps him to heal and recover. And then you see the Satan's being removed from the picture. And these are all the different, on the left you see, I kind of wrote out what Blake himself had just written in the margins, and they're derived from different parts of scripture. So you've got quotations from the Psalms, Psalm 8. When I behold the heavens and the work of thy hands, the moon and stars, which thou hast ordained, then I say, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him? We know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. This is Job praying for his friends, looking very much like the God figure in the previous plate. And that's a real turning point in the book of Job as well. Like when his friends have wronged him, and God knows that, sees that, they've accused him of wrongdoing. They've actually been, they're called miserable comforters, rather than being like really good friends, like just lamenting with him, they've been making his suffering worse. And God wants to show mercy to the friends and also help Job sort of forgive them. So he calls on Job to pray for them. And after that, in some translations, it says, and God turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. And I think that's something that is a theme throughout the Bible, like praying for those who persecute you. Not just pray, oh, help me to love that person. It's actually, no, pray for them. And then you notice that you can be freed of like anger or unforgiveness towards them as well. And this is something that I pick up on in my own work, the figure of Job's wife and also his three daughters. His wife isn't named, but the three daughters that he has after his ordeal are named, Jemima, Keziah, and Keren Hapuk, which translates as like bottle of eye shadow in in the Hebrew, which is really interesting. And I really love that verse. And their father gave them an inheritance alongside their brethren, their brothers, that's really cool, because this book was written in a very patriarchal time, so it's not unsurprising that Job's wife wasn't named. But I like the fact that special mention is given to the three daughters and that they are given an inheritance with their brothers, which I think is really like cool theme. And we come to the final plate. I'll move on to the next section as quick as I can. And he says, I'll just share this quotation from Blake, which I actually just found quite recently. And now so it's a letter to Thomas Butts, his friend and patron. And now let me finish with assuring you that though I have been very unhappy, Blake writes, I am again emerged into the light of day. I still and shall to eternity embrace Christianity and adore him who is the expressed image of God. But I have travelled through perils and darkness, not unlike a champion. I have conquered, and I shall go on conquering. Nothing can withstand the fury of my course among the stars and the stars of God, and in the abysses of the accuser. My enthusiasm is still what it was, only enlarged and confirmed. And that's Blake speaking, like before he makes the engravings. But he sounds a bit Job-like towards the end of the narrative. My enthusiasm is still what it was, only enlarged and confirmed. So that's the book of Job according to Blake. And I'll move on now quickly to my own work. This is a recent, pretty sketchy work that I did in February. I was really down in February. I was like feeling worse than I had in a really long time, and it just actually gave me a lot of compassion for people who have been finding particularly the pandemic difficult. I was like, oh, I've been kind of fine, like I haven't felt sad in quite a long time, like not chronically sad, but it was good for like building up empathy. But you can see two figures. It's like a self-portrait of myself, but also in the hand, there's a figure of Job praying for his friends. And I suppose they were things that I was thinking about at the same time. I was trying to make quite an expressive work that hopefully would be quite cathartic, but also you have this image of someone crouching and praying for someone else, so having to sort of think outside of themselves and not be so inward looking and introspective, which in my experience, like for me, is something that like grief and finding things hard does. And that I might actually make into either a woodcut or a painting. It's kind of just an idea at the moment. Yeah, so one of the things that I think is quite prevalent in my work is the theme of lament. And last year, or a couple of years ago, I heard Helen Cammack speak at an event at the drawing school in London, and she was talking about lament as loss, longing, resistance, and resilience. And that really, I thought that was a really good definition of lament. I think each of those four terms is really powerful, because I think with loss, it's like acknowledging that you've lost something. There's longing for things to change. Resistance I think protest can be part of lament. It's like seeing that there's injustice and something wrong happening. A lot of art at the moment, has this kind of lament in it. I think people are kind of interested in exploring kind of deeper themes, and even like grief over the environment, or like grief over like racism historically and things. These are things that we should be protesting, and resilience as well is a part of lament. And I think one thing that we see in the Book of Job is like there's an increased, he's stronger than when he's refined, and he's strengthened, his faith is strengthened, it's been tested and purified. And then there's this quotation by N.T. Wright, the theologian: lament takes the pain of the world into the presence of God. And I really like that, because I think it kind of acknowledges that I think lament should be a corporate thing, or we should be able to lament on behalf of other people. And that idea of like, yeah, that's the best way to kind of like, I think, to kind of deal with sorrow. So lament is something that has occurred in my work quite a lot. This is from my undergrad. It's based on a painting by Nicolas Poussin, 1647, from his series, The Sacraments, the seven sacraments in Roman Catholicism, and they believe in seven sacraments, Protestantism too. But one of them in Catholicism is the sacrament of penance. And so this image, he had shown this woman washing the feet of Christ, and he took that to be her act of penance. And I got my sister to pose as that woman. She was dressed in yellow and have her hair down, which in those times was a symbol of being a loose woman, or, and she was washing Christ's feet with her hair. And to me, this image and the passage that it refers to in Luke's gospel is about like having sorrow over your sin, but also like deep gratitude for in the acknowledgement that you've been forgiven. Those who are forgiven much love much. And so here you see an idea of lament and worship coming together. And this is more recent work. So this is from my postgraduate at the drawing school, and it's called My Intercessor is My Friend. And I'll show you some other versions of it, but it's copper plate etching. It's one etching placed on top of the other, and this one has a roll-on ground as well, if anyone's into printmaking. And I'd been reading Job chapter 16 a lot, and really was captivated by it. It's really deeply sad lament from the poetic section of Job. And I'll just read the last section here. I have sewn sackcloth over my skin and buried my brow in the dust. My face is red with weeping, dark shadows ring my eyes. Yet my hands have been free of violence, and my prayer is pure. Earth, do not cover my blood. May my cry never be laid to rest. And then this is the section that really like captured my imagination when I was reading it. Even now, my witness is in heaven, my advocate is on high, my intercessor is my friend. As my eyes pour out tears to God on behalf of a man, he pleads with God as one pleads for a friend. Only a few years will pass before I take the path of no return. And I actually, like, first of all, thought about making a kind of concrete poem. And I was playing around with it last night, and just think, like, arranging the words so that high in heaven, or like raised up. I have dyslexia, like many artists, and I find like where words are placed, well, they can jumble, but they can also be arranged strategically so that the message goes in more. And so this idea of intercession, so like pleading with someone on behalf of someone else, or mediating, is big in Job. And as we've mentioned before, like Job does that for, first of all, his children and then his friends. But here, like, this is a book that's written, we think maybe, 500 years before the coming of Christ. And it seems that Job is talking about Jesus in heaven, praying for him, pleading with him to God the Father. And Job is placing his hope in that. And it's interesting because that Mark Leckey figurine I saw briefly before moving to London and didn't think it worked its way into my work at all. But it maybe did. I think there are some similarities between this print and also Mark Leckey's figurine. And also I did think about this when I was doing it, Dürer's Melancholia. This is another version and another version. And then these are the two plates printed separately. And you can like compare the kind of mood of them. You can compare where I've done detail and where I've left blanks. Yeah, I think one of them looks really tormented and angsty and lamenty, and the other one's quite like peaceful and actually reassuring himself, even now my witness is in heaven, like I am being held. And it's quite interesting because I think it's quite an androgynous figure, and I think as a woman, I don't want to make too much about like, myself, the way I'm coming at it, but I think like reading it as a woman, you often identify more with the female characters, or I think even if you're trying not to, when you're trying to draw, if you're drawing from memory, someone, you often end up drawing someone that looks more like yourself. So this is quite different. I quite often work with tracing paper when I'm planning prints. I was really like haunted by the idea of the house collapsing on the children of Job. And so yeah, this is an image of plans for some prints that I was doing. And Blake's version, well, Blake, as I said, used the King James version of the Bible, but he also kind of tweaked some of the words, like not in a ways that made a big difference. But for example, he talked about and the four, I'll read it here. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote upon the four faces of the house. So rather than the four corners of the house, which you see in the Bible, he talked about the faces of the house, which I thought was quite beautiful. So I basically used the different words that Blake had. I used the different titles for his different plates I used as a way of structuring my own project on the Book of Job. And this is a much larger piece that I made, and you can barely see it, but there are words written on tracing paper stuck to it. It first of all started as a kind of portrait, like on its side rotated from that, and I was doing an image of a son and a daughter. And I bought a resin skull, which I would draw from. It was like an anatomical skull, just so I could understand like this, have it as a prop for like understanding the structure of the head. And yeah, that collapsing building, playing around with scale, thinking about like the foundations of the building going into the ground, and it being like, you know, when you see like a swimming pool, yeah, just, it's a lamenting image. This is a close-up. When I was at the opening night of our end of year show at the drawing school, I heard people talking about this, being like, oh, that's so dark. And I was like, that's true. And I think there's something quite, I often do feel with my work, like can feel quite vulnerable showing it because it's so heartfelt. Maybe the intercessor image more so, but like it's so sincere that it can feel quite awkward. And I remember in my final year at ECA, Grayson Perry did the Wreath lecture series, and he talked about sincerity being like a great taboo in the arts, and it being, I think that sincerity can be more disarming than parody sometimes. But it's like often, not always how I work in my art, but it's often there. Again, pretending I'm a concrete poet. This is a life drawing, but it just reminded me when I was doing it, I was thinking about Job, because there was something so sort of vulnerable about this man who I was drawing. And then some, like, I guess slightly different style. Again, I took the title for this from the Blake engravings. With dreams upon my bed, thou scarest me and affrightest me with visions. And I guess you can see the kind of house that goes into the foundations. Its foundations go into the earth. You can see that in this, in his mind, in this, and the toppled tree, because the wind from the wilderness has blown it down. But I was thinking of making an embroidery of this onto a cushion, a pillow. Miserable comforter. The daughters of Job, given inheritance alongside their brothers. I really love that. I'm one of 3 girls, have a brother as well, but I kind of really, I gravitate towards anything with like 3 women, because 3 graces or whatever. Yeah. So again, I was trying to prepare prints with that, so using tracing paper. And I made a print based on it alongside their brothers and inheritance. It's quite nice just to like latch on to phrases like that, to know your importance is equal to men's. This wee sketch I did was really like, basically when I did my work on my postgraduate in 2019, I'd basically written my dissertation in 2014 on the Book of Job by Blake's version. But I tried not to look at any of Blake's work because I didn't want to be too heavily influenced. But you can see the kind of upright hair of this figure, and then a spirit passed before my face and the hair on my flesh stood up. I mean, it's definitely kind of referencing the Blake image, I think, or at least my imagination was kind of grown through that. Monumental Hands, I called this one, although it doesn't look monumental. I think but it was like, I guess, with your hands being lifted up, you see it in some of Blake's depictions of Job. It's like a gesture of worship, but also lament. It's like, what are you doing? But also like, help me, and also like, I'm raising you up. The wife of Job. She suffered like about as much as Job. I mean, she wasn't attacked in her flesh in the same way, but she lost all of her children, and I think that's like, it's horrendous. This is an image kind of related to the wife of Job. On the left you see it's a drawing I did after Duncan Grant's drawing of Vanessa Bell, who's Virginia Woolf's sister, and they're kind of all part of the Bloomsbury set, very linked. And it just looks so poignant and sad. And then I was going to make it into an etching, and during that time between the drawing and the etching, a friend of mine, her son died in a car crash, and so I kind of made the print as a kind of, it became less about Vanessa, more about this lady, and it was kind of an outpouring of grief. And it's I was thinking about her all the time, and I almost thought about naming it after her instead of Vanessa. So it's like the meaning changed. And I mentioned before, I liked that Elihu comment, I am young and you are very old, wherefore I was afraid. I found it really, it made me laugh, but I don't know if the humour comes across in this image. That's Job, his wife, staring out. And then I added another plate with another face, sort of perhaps Elihu, perhaps a different friend, looking at him quite accusingly, balancing out the wife's face, which is based on my own, actually. Don't know if it's not obvious. Did some different colour versions of it, using copper, zinc and aluminium for the different plates. They have different effects. This is a drawing I did in the Blake room in Tate Britain after Blake's drawing of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, because I think there's a sort of similar idea of that kind of grief and torment, the righteous sufferer. And then when the morning stars sang together and all the sons shouted for joy, knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? This is one of the final images I'll show. It's one of my largest pieces. And I always, when I was preparing for the studio show for my postgraduate, I was thinking I'm just going to run with this Blake Job thing. It's obviously like a real passion of mine, so I just need to go with it. And so I wanted to make that climactic scene quite the largest piece of work that I made. And so you have like references to different parts of these chapters when God is answering Job out of the whirlwind. You even have a curtain on the right top corner being pulled away so Job can see into the unseen realm. On my wall at the time I had this a postcard of this image by Marc Chagall, one of his more sort of restricted palette images for the Jewish theatre in 1920. I think it really did feed into the work. And I also had a big veil kind of curtain on the wall next to it. That's Job kind of being a bit blinded by this apparition. And now I come to, I guess, one of the the last main image that I'll show. And this is based on my favourite verse in the book of Job. I have just written down. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him. I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. And that's from Job 19. Job speaking about his Redeemer. He's speaking with longing. That's one of the things that Helen Kamick includes in her definition of suffering. And he's acknowledging that his skin, which is already covered in boils, will be destroyed, but he will in his flesh yet see God. He'll see him in his flesh. And so I guess it's this idea of like being given new bodies and seeing a physical Redeemer. And I guess I was kind of Blakean there. I kind of had references to Ephesians. This is another version of it. And Malachi, the Son of Man will come with healing in his wings. And it's actually part engraving. So it says before, earlier in the passage, it says, oh, that my words were written, that my words were inscribed. I can't really see the image and I've forgotten it off the top of my head, that they were engraved on rock forever. And so I wanted to do an engraving. I wanted to try engraving for the first time. It's part etching, part engraving, because it felt quite like lovely that Joe really wanted his words to be engraved forever. And they have. I mean, they've been recorded for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But there's Job rising from his grave. It's kind of a bit like Stanley Spencer's massive painting of everyone rising from their graves at the Tate Britain downstairs, in the other version. And so I started with this image, and I'll finish with it as well. It's based on a drawing I did. You can see the drawing featuring here. It was actually of Hogarth's bust in the National Portrait Gallery, but I made it into a print with a painting over it, a series of prints. And I guess, like, for me, it just looks like the series together looks like it's a man who's being tested, kind of going through a fiery trial and coming out kind of refined and stronger, going from, yeah, like Eden to the new creation, if you think about it in terms of that progression from, yeah, something more robust than it had been originally, even in its happy initial state. And so that's where I'll end. And I hope, yeah, I realise it went on for quite a while, but I hope we have a lot to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catriona. That was very interesting.